Okay, so let me remove my sound for a moment. Welcome to NuFor Online. This is the second of our nuclear forensics conference series that AWE, in partnership with the Institute of Physics, have put together. Now, we're going to cover what nuclear forensics is while we go through this. I should explain, this is the second conference. The first one we held last year at the University of Bristol, who kindly agreed to host us. And the intention was, when I conceived of this idea, to come up with a conference that was different. I go to many conferences regarding nuclear forensics, and they all serve a purpose. But the issue with them for me was I'm always looking for the next breed of people that are going to come into nuclear forensics, those new experts and practitioners. The problem is nuclear forensics is not that well known. And if you're not in the field, you may not know that you have key skills and knowledge and experience that's of value to programs like mine. So I came up with the idea of getting basically the great and the good in nuclear forensics across the world to come together and talk about what they do, really show how exciting the work is that we do. And the audience, rather than being those who are already working in the field and already converted, as it were, I wanted to make sure that people who have never heard of it, but might have an interest in it if they did, could come into nuclear forensics. So when I came into this 5 years ago, I had no idea that I would have a need of a geologist. Uranium ore and uranium ore concentrates, definitely the preserve of geologists. So we have those. Planetary scientists, cosmochemists, as they're called, physicists, even an astrophysicist. I had no idea I would need these disciplines in the program, but they all have key skills. They have knowledge about analytical techniques, spectroscopy, spectrometry. The same scientists that can look at the clouds on Jupiter are the same scientists that have a use in nuclear forensics. And nuclear forensics is really important. It supports national nuclear security in whatever state that you're in. And there are some high profile cases that we've all heard of, Litvinenko in 2006, for example. And states need to be prepared. So nuclear forensics is all about being prepared, being able to identify nuclear material that's fallen out of regulatory control, finding out whether it was yours, did it originate in your own country or not? And then to look further, where might it have come from? Particularly where might it have come from within the nuclear fuel cycle as you understand it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on now to our speakers. Over the next 2 days, you're going to hear from some really good speakers. Today, we've got Mansi Iyer, who works for the Office of Nuclear Smuggling, Detection and Deterrence, which is part of the National Nuclear Security Administration in the US. And later on, Professor Robin Grimes from Imperial College London, who is also a Chief Scientific Advisor Nuclear for the Ministry of Defence. And then later on, Paul Thompson from AWE, who has years of experience in nuclear forensics and nuclear chemistry related matters. And Zolt Varga from the Joint Research Council in Europe, to name but a few. So we've got quite a packed couple of hours today and tomorrow afternoon. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, please post them, and we'll try and pick them up as we go, or we'll at least try and answer them at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Mansi Iyer. Thank you, Mansi.
Thank you, Roy. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone, whatever time it is where you're at. My apologies. I am not going to be able to use slides for my presentation today, but I'm going to be talking a little bit about nuclear forensics and international collaboration from the perspective of my office, which is the Nuclear Smuggling Detection and Deterrence Office. So we have to think about this, right? As Roy mentioned, this is very important for nuclear security, nuclear forensics is. What happens if law enforcement interdicts and detects and interdicts a container of nuclear materials or a strong radioactive source at a border or at a checkpoint or at a festival or something like that, or an improvised nuclear device prior to detonation. In both these scenarios, law enforcement and security agencies will be under tremendous pressure to answer certain questions. Some of these questions are who does this belong to? Is it mine? Does it belong to someone else? Is there more of it? Who is responsible? Nuclear forensics really helps in answering these questions. Without going too much into technical details, or actually none at all, um, we should look at nuclear forensics from the law enforcement perspective. Why do we want to do this? Well, because nuclear forensics is what helps us to a successful prosecution of the perpetrators. Nuclear forensics conclusions follow a process. They rely upon a process. You start with interdiction of the material, followed by the analysis of the material, its evaluation, and then interpretation by subject matter experts. So you have analysis, you've got the interpretation, but you want to make sure that what you've done, you have confidence in the results. You don't want errors all over the place, right? How do we do this? We make sure that there are validated methods in place, demonstrated competencies, and certified reference materials for the analysis and for the interpretation. Legal procedures must be followed and documented. You want to make sure that evidence collection and chain of custody in each and every step is documented. Its transportation and storage is documented. Any different steps in the laboratory are documented. Pictures. There are never enough pictures. And if you can take video, that is also a great way to document what you're doing. And then it leads to good and successful prosecution. So what are some of the resource challenges in nuclear forensics, right? Nuclear forensics is wonderful. Roy mentioned earlier that it's not very well known. One of the biggest challenges is getting the right people. It's a multidisciplinary field. You need geologists, you need chemists, you need nuclear engineers, physicists.
So Mansi, we may have lost you. Are you there?
Ah, can you hear me now? Sorry, was I on mute the whole time?
Yeah, you're back now.
Okay, excellent. So I was talking about some of the resource challenges in nuclear forensics. One is getting the right people. As I mentioned earlier, before I was muted or muted myself, my PhD is in astrophysics. Nuclear forensics is a multidisciplinary field, and you want to make sure that you have the right people with the right skills, or at least the right technical background, and then you can train these students, researchers in nuclear forensics. You want folks who are trained geologists, chemists, radiochemists, and like I said, encouragement comes in great ways. Fellowships, scholarships, internships, all of these go a long way, and opportunities to present at international conferences like this. What are some of the other challenges? Funding issues. Well, that's an obvious one. No one has an obscene amount of money that we can just spend on any certain area. This is a problem, not just in nuclear forensics. It is a problem, period. The other one is coordination and sequencing of international awareness raising activities between various international organizations and donor states. Identifying an end state for nuclear forensics. When is it over? When does my country have enough? Human resource considerations. Yes, you have the problem of recruiting people, But then you also have the issue of maintaining and sustaining the staff, the qualified staff that you already have in place. Um, Nuclear forensics, luckily, is not something we need to do every day. So how are we going to keep these people gainfully employed? And then, of course, there are conflicting priorities. For example, country A may have more issues with drug smuggling than with nuclear smuggling, and that's where their funding goes. So how do you counteract with that? I think I'm back again. Some of the possible mitigations to these challenges are: make sure your policymakers and people who are funding you are aware of the importance of nuclear forensics, how the technical aspect of it assists law enforcement and vice versa. Recruit the new generation of leaders and technical experts in a wide range of fields relevant to nuclear forensics. I would say don't wait till graduate or postgraduate degrees. Start at A levels or in high school and introduce students to science and technology relevant to nuclear forensics. Also enhance the ability of universities and national laboratories to collaboratively work on advanced research in the nuclear forensics field. So we do all of this, but one thing that we do need to consider, and which is the topic of my conversation, is have international collaborations. International collaborations are very important. And why is that? Well, the number one reason is because it enhances domestic nuclear forensics capabilities. Not every country has alpha spectrometry or gamma spectrometry, but if you have an international collaboration in place based on your laws of prosecution, you can work with other countries and enhance your um, existing capabilities that are already present in your country. It strengthens domestic prosecution of nuclear smugglers. It strengthens regional and multinational partnerships. And of course, you are contributing to the global threat of illicit use of nuclear material by reducing it with that international collaboration. So where and how do we find these international collaborations? Well, some of you are already aware through many international organizations such as the IAEA, the Nuclear Forensics International Technical Working Group, ITWIG, and the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, among a few. Then, of course, you have your regional technical support centers, the IAEA Nuclear Security Support Center, and the EU Centers of Excellence. And of course, capacity building assistance providers such as the JRC, and then agencies within the United States, such as Department of State, Department of Defense, and my own office, which is the Nuclear Smuggling Detection and Deterrence Office. Let's talk a little bit about the NSDD perspective. The Office of Nuclear Smuggling Detection and Deterrence is an office within the United States Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. Our mission is to strengthen the capabilities and commitment of our partner countries to detect, deter, and investigate the illicit trafficking of nuclear and radiological materials. We've had, since 1998, established a network of 100 agencies in more than 85 plus countries working towards a common goal of disrupting smuggling and preventing terrorist acquisition of dangerous materials. And we also collaborate and support with international organizations such as the IAEA, Interpol, the European Union, GICNT, Global Partnership, ITWIG, and the Border Monitoring Working Group. Our forensics mission within NSDD is well aligned with our detection mission. How do we do this? Our program objectives needs across partner countries are the same. Where did I find it? Is it mine? We also have nuclear forensics toolbox, which we can adapt based on country needs. Then we also have existing capabilities in place, such as trainings, workshops, and exercises our regulations team, and performance and evaluation improvement that we can assist countries with based on our detection mission. We also would utilize our a broad range of partner country contacts, say when we're initiating a new engagement. So the fact that we work in 100 plus countries really gives us motivation and a way to move means forward if we're starting a new nuclear forensics collaboration. How do we do this? We have a phased approach. We try to build baseline nuclear capabilities that would answer questions such as, what is it? Is it mine? This is mainly for interdicted material, the initial steps, baby steps. And then we have the more advanced scientific peer-to-peer exchanges with select countries, where we concentrate more on laboratory analysis to find out how good are we at this, are we efficient? Can we learn together to improve this? And then finally, we support international efforts for awareness by providing instructors and subject matter experts for trainings, workshops, exercises, and guidance material development. So for NSDD, some of our specific examples of collaboration are we assess existing nuclear forensics capabilities. We also have a few workshops and exercises that we work with our partner countries on. Some of them are apps, which is applications of existing technologies to aid a nuclear forensics investigation, the analytical plan development, the National Nuclear Forensics Library, gamma spectrometry, and NuFor simulation exercise. We also conduct peer-to-peer scientific exchanges for methodology advancement and to enhance measurement confidence. So here we are doing all this fantastic work. And I looked at my calendar at the beginning of 2020 and said to myself, oh boy, I'm not going to be home. And then guess what? Come March, how does international collaboration work in these times when we're not able to travel? It's even more important now. So two of the things that we have been doing during this pandemic is that our peer-to-peer work continues with some of our partner countries based on COVID conditions, whether people can get to their labs or not. And then the second one is what we call Spectral Flavor of the Month. This is a round robin gamma spectrometry exercise, which we send out every month. We send gamma spectrometry to our partner countries. We have about 19 countries participating right now with over 50 participants. And we send out the drill and we send the solution at the end of the month. They have a month to complete it. And we are now in the 4th month of this drill, and it has been going very well. So somehow we are continuing very well, coming up with some new and innovative ideas to work during this pandemic. And to end this presentation, I would quickly go through a quick summary. My apologies, I can't get to my slide to move. And yes, there are no slides with this presentation. Nuclear forensics is an international endeavor and has a role in the prevention of and response portions of nuclear security. International collaboration is very important, not only to reduce the global threat, but also to enhance domestic capabilities. And our NSDD capacity building training and workshop products complement other international trainings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mansi. Really interesting talk as usual. I'll wait to see if there's any questions to come through at the Q&A there. In the meantime, I have a few. So you mentioned briefly about the the need to understand the materials and sort of build that capacity and capability. In terms of the particular threats and types of material, the IAEA obviously produce their regular reporting of in the incident and trafficking database. But for you, and also for your state, what do you think are the most concerning materials that nuclear forensics practitioners should be concerned about, and the type of threat?
I'm not sure I can answer that question.
In the round.
uh, I would say every material is a threat because, you know, you don't quite know what quantity you're going to get it in, whether it's been masked or shielded. I would not downplay any material or radiological sample or material. So I would say pay attention to it all.
Okay. Now, in terms of capacity building, you mentioned about bringing in SMEs, recruitment, and so on, and trying to engage with them. For you, what do you think is the most effective way of engaging, particularly people who don't really understand what it is we all do and how important it is? What's the most effective way of getting people in and keeping them in?
I think one of the best ways is encouraging people, and, you know, making science to a lot of people is not sexy. So how do you make science sexy? Well, there are some wonderful aspects about doing nuclear forensics and being in the nuclear security field that just doesn't involve having your head in a book. You travel, you meet interesting people, you come across interesting problems that you don't learn about in a textbook. And it's very important to talk to young recruits and people coming into the field about these and some of the little adventures that you've had all along. I think that makes things really interesting and could spike interest.
Excellent answer. So just another question. What technologies do you use to detect hidden illegal materials? I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to answer that.
Depends what you're looking for. That's my answer.
I'll expand a little bit for the sake of some of our audience who may not understand. So nuclear forensics, we're here to talk about it, tell people that it exists, and it's an interesting and really exciting thing to be involved in. However, some states, in fact most states, quite rightly are quite protective and sensitive about the technologies that we use to detect hidden illegal materials. And it's pretty obvious why there would be a sensitivity about that. And it's basically because we don't want the bad guys to circumvent what we do. We don't want them to know how we detect. It's not in our interests. So you probably won't find very many practitioners who are going to answer that question, I'm afraid. So unless there's any others, Mansi, I think that was a really good start to our conference. However, looks like something's just come through. Hold on. Okay, you're not off the hook yet, Mansi. In terms of nuclear security, does local government or international bodies impose regulations on the nuclear industry? And how do the scientists at nuclear facilities respond to these regulations? Can nuclear forensics have any effect on the nuclear industry as a whole in terms of efficiency benefits? And then there's another question after you've thought about that one.
So I think it can, based on the technology. I think it's very important for industry, regulators, and practitioners to work together to figure that out. You know, you think of a situation where you're at a port and it's all about the traffic. You want to bring in as many containers as possible. But then again, you still have to check them for drugs and other illicit material. But somehow you've just got to find a way to work so that security is not compromised. I would use that analogy to answer that question.
Thank you. And possibly finally, what are some current interesting problems that need solutions at the moment? Possibly any that you haven't already mentioned, actually.
I really think funding is an issue because when something doesn't happen every day and it's not in your face, people forget how important it is. that's, to me, is a big problem. And, I'm not saying that we should get millions and millions, but just a good amount to make sure that we're able to hold on and recruit the right people and make sure our skills are up to date. I think just recruiting and keeping talent and making sure that our funding is at a good level, to me, are still the biggest challenges.
Excellent, thank you. Right, if there are no more questions, we'll move on. So thank you ever so much, Mansi. Once again, it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.
And
thank you everyone else.
And stick around for tomorrow for the panel discussion. So we're going to have a slight change to the agenda now, as stated. And I'm going to give you a short brief, a primer, as it were, on nuclear forensics, because it's occurred to me that we haven't actually said what nuclear forensics is. So let's see if we can make this work. I apologize for my video, it's going a little bit awry. So let's see if we can do this. Okay, so I'm afraid I won't be able to see the questions coming up as we go. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and pick them up at the end. I think that'll be the easiest thing. So I'm going to discuss nuclear forensics at AWE, that's who I work for, and why we're building a national capability and what that capability actually is. So just quickly, I'm going to run through what nuclear forensics is, why the UK is developing such capability, how we're doing it. I'm going to mention briefly the Nuclear Forensics Library. Now, Mansi mentioned just briefly National Nuclear Forensics Libraries, and I want to touch on what that is. And then I'm going to do a shameless plug for NuFor 2021, our third conference, which may or may not be in person. So, nuclear forensics, what is it? So basically, if nuclear material falls out of regulatory control, which basically means it's not where it should be, it's not under lock and key, it's not with authorized people, we're going to want to know what it is, where's it come from, who's involved, and where's it been. Really end-to-end analysis of that material. And when we say who's involved, we really mean for the police investigation. It's generally, at least in the UK, it's illegal to possess nuclear and radioactive materials without due authorization. So in almost all conceivable cases, it's going to be a police matter. So they're going to want to know who's involved. Where's it from? So for us, this is about provenancing, but in terms of the nuclear fuel cycle. So we're not necessarily trying to find out which region in the world it's from. We may get to that, but we're really talking about where in the nuclear fuel cycle the materials have risen from. So how does that work in practice? So we have a radiological or nuclear incident. So in this particular example, interdicted material or a contaminated scene, materials are recovered. And then we have an in-field response. The police may send people in, do some sampling of the radioactive and nuclear materials, do some monitoring, some transport preparation, and in-field screening, sort of quick down and dirty measurements. Is it radioactive? Is it not? What kind of radioactivity is it? Alpha, beta, gamma, and so on. Once we know this, the materials can be recovered. Most of the time, they're going to be recovered to AWE, because that's where our capability lies. And then the police will join forces with certain leads at AWE to hold a case conference, also known as a forensic strategy meeting. And that is intended to allow us to plan the analysis. You may only have a finite amount of sample of material, and you're going to want to be able to make sure you get the best out of that, the best analysis that you can, and not use all the material, of course. The police may want some to be retained. We also play alongside conventional forensics. I won't go into that because that's outside the scope of this talk. But we then move into the laboratory analysis. Once the analytical plan has been formulated, we move into the laboratory analysis, however long that takes. And that covers all sorts of things, including bulk, trace, and so on. And then that information, along with other information, potentially from the police, feeds into a provenance assessment. What do we know about that material? Where's it been? Who had it? Where should it have been in the nuclear fuel cycle? And that information is then passed to the police and also to Her Majesty's government for further work. So how we do this, I said you only have a finite amount of material unless it's a massive drum of material, like yellow cake or something. But the point is, and as it says there, you never know what you're going to get. And you don't. Every scenario will be different. One day it'll be interdicted material from a lorry. Another day it'll be something that's been found that just shouldn't be where it's been discovered. And really, we're going to be looking at everything. The actinide materials, the plutonium, the uranium, and so on. We'll be looking at manufacturing materials. Is there other stuff with it that gives an indication as to where in the nuclear fuel cycle it comes from? There may be geographic markers. We've done some work in the past about soils, detritus, that may be an indication of where in the world the stuff's come from, or where in your country it's come from, and other forensic markers. The image in the middle there is basically just a sort of hypothetical illustration that we have a scanning electron microscope stub, so we can do some really high magnification microscopy. And you could have a fleck of paint, and on that fleck of paint there might be tool marks that give you an indication of what kind of process it's been through. There may be attached fibers. Again, there's some forensic value in the fibers. Information about the physical geography. Could be anything on there that tells you something about where or what plants that material's come from. Could be unique manufacturing materials. Obviously, there could be actinide particles like uranium, plutonium. Could even be explosives on it that could be forensically identified. And then, of course, there could be special materials that are only known to a certain industrial process, which again gives us an indication as to where in the nuclear fuel cycle something comes from. We collect all of this information up, we compare it with what we know for our own country, so various databases, and basically tie the nuclear forensics element in, this exploitation of the sample, with conventional forensics, and you have effectively a total forensic exploitation as far as you can. So why are we doing this? Well, Mancy's pretty much touched on this really well. But for the UK, it's actually underwritten by the Strategic Defence and Security Review and our counter-terrorism strategy. So this is about our national defence and our homeland security, for want of a better description. And really, we want to know, did the stuff come from our own stock? Before we worry about whether it's come from outside of the country, you want to know if you've actually lost control of your own materials. That's really important. And I'm glad to say the UK has a really good grasp of its nuclear materials and radioactive materials. So it's highly unlikely, but you do still have to be able to rule out your own materials. And it makes it a lot easier when you're then looking further afield to see where that material has come from. Oops. So it's a global concern, which is what, again, Mancy has touched on. The International Atomic Energy Agency publish, not openly, I have to say, but publish some figures. These are broad terms which you can pick up in the open literature. But since '93, when the recording began of incidents involving trafficking and so on, or just lost materials or materials that have fallen out of regulatory control, it's been over 3,500 confirmed incidents. And that sounds terrible, but actually only 287 of those, when I took figures from their site, were trafficking related. And of those, only 4 involved plutonium, and only 34 involved high enriched uranium. So they're not huge numbers. So this isn't a big problem, but it does indicate that material does end up where it shouldn't, and we all should be suitably prepared. So our stakeholders, I've pretty much touched on this, but if material is found outside of regulatory control, we want to make sure that we know it's consistent, particularly for AWE, who primarily work for the Ministry of Defence. We want to make sure that the material isn't the same as their material. So they haven't lost their material. So we have in the UK the material split into two groups: defence and civil. Defence is obviously covered by the Ministry of Defence. Civil is looked after by the National Nuclear Laboratory, and that covers things like nuclear reactors and so on. But the questions are the same: is it our material? The police, of course, they have primacy in all investigations, and their priorities are going to be about gathering evidence, the evidence management, and the prosecution of the case. So despite that, all of the questions really boil down to the same thing. What is it? What was its intended use? Where is it from? Where's it been? How did it get here in the first place? And probably more importantly, for a significant case, is there more? Particularly if it's in something quite bad and worrying, we'd want to know if there's more, and certainly the police would want to know that. But it's not always easy to separate between military and civil material. It's definitely not black and white. A fuel pellet may turn up and it may be a certain shape and size, and we can say, yes, it's from a civil nuclear reactor. That's easy. More often, it's going to be bits of stuff, and it's not so simple to work out what it is. It may be a bag of powder. So the defence and the civil sectors, AWE and NNL, have to work in partnership and solve this problem. And it's a puzzle, basically, to be solved. And this is where the National Nuclear Forensics Library comes in. So the IAEA had a really good idea some years ago, where they recommended that all states should, wherever possible, if they have nuclear materials or radioactive materials in their country, and or they have materials transiting through, they should, as best as they can, have a good handle on what that material is, and ideally have a database, even if it's as simple as a spreadsheet for, you know, if it's just a small amount of material. That's fine. If you've got a country where the nuclear industry is over 70 years old, like the UK, it's a bit more difficult trying to pin everything down, catalogue everything. In an ideal world, of course, we would catalogue everything. We'd have this super database with all of the materials in that we know about. But that's not practical. It's not easy to manage because it would be huge. And some of the nuclear industry in the UK is commercial, and there are commercial sensitivities. So not everybody wants to share all of their information. I'm sure they would, and they certainly would, to help support the case. But in a preparation of readiness, it's not necessary for them to share everything, so we don't ask. What we do instead is understand what we can about the nuclear fuel cycle in the UK. So we look at things like the material properties, material age, how material ages, radioactive materials age. And then we have the process information. Nuclear materials go through lots of different processes. Not all nuclear materials are the same, even if they're the same compound. They may well have gone through different routes to become what they are. And all of these become, sort of in the round, nuclear fuel cycle signatures. And we will take that information and compare with what we know about UK material data. We'll also apply some statistical analysis and modelling. So one of the things about nuclear materials is they're normally analysed for what the customer requires, what the end product requires. And that doesn't mean that all materials get analysed for everything. That's just not how it works. It's not cost effective to do that either. For nuclear forensics, we would love it if everyone who worked with nuclear materials analysed for every single analyte. They looked at everything, because it would be great for us. It would be a fantastic resource, but that's just not practical. So sometimes we have data that's there, and other times we have data that's not there that we wish was. And this is where the statistical analysis and modelling comes in, where we can make predictions about what a material should look like or might look like if it's been through a certain process. And then we can compare it with what we've found. So this is then made even more complicated when you consider, particularly in the UK, material wasn't just produced for the military purposes or civil purposes. Sometimes they were produced for both. And one openly documented example of this was the use of Magnox reactors to produce weapons-grade plutonium for the early bomb program. It's no longer the case, but it's a good example of where a nuclear reactor that was producing energy was also being used to support a weapons program. So this makes it difficult, particularly if you've got other countries where nuclear material might fall out of regulatory control and there might be dual use. So it's very difficult to differentiate between the two. So what is the Nuclear Forensics Library? So you've probably guessed by now, it's not a library. I've already said it's too expensive, it's too cumbersome, and it's not proportionate to the task. We may only use this once in a lifetime. It would be a gargantuan task to try and collate all the nuclear material data and information in the UK into one place. So what I came up with when I came into this program 5 years ago was to look at the system, not as a library. And working in close partnership with NNL, we mirror each other. What we really do is worry about how to produce a provenance assessment. And the best way to do that is get a load of subject matter experts, specialists, together in a room, it's a virtual room these days, have them have access to local data libraries. So AWE and NNL will both have their own local libraries of information, and have that information feeding in to that assembly of experts or specialists known as a provenance assessment panel. So we have one for defence and one for civil, just to break the work up. And they are led by a reporting officer, so named because that's the person who's going to be reporting this assessment. The best analogy I can give you is think of them as the foreman of a jury. So you've got a jury of 12 and they're going to be led by the foreman. Our reporting officer does a similar job. He or she is a strategic leader over that panel to help them get the information they need and also get the reach back that they need. So we don't just look inward to AWE and NNL, we also look outward. So we tap into expertise externally across the UK's nuclear enterprise, including Magnox, Rolls-Royce, Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, and so on, just to name but a few. And we also work carefully with our regulators as well, the Office of Nuclear Regulation and the Defence Nuclear Security Regulator, and the National Nuclear Archive, of course, because there's a wealth of information and knowledge there that could be of use in a provenance assessment. So we don't collate lots of data and information. We know where a lot of it is, and we know how to access it around the country through points of contact. And we produce an assessment that goes to the police and government. So that's the National Nuclear Forensics Library construct. So it's not a library. And this is just showing this in action. So the provenance assessment panel is made up of different disciplines. I mentioned when I opened the conference, I didn't know that I would need very specific disciplines like astrophysicists and geologists and so on. But within these subject matter areas, we've got a range of different disciplines supporting these. This is just an illustration. There could be, depends on the case, but you could have all manner of expertise being applied here. And then that assessment report is produced and passed on to the police senior investigating officer who manages the overall case. In the images below, that is actually my provenance assessment panel during one of our exercises about a year ago, working hard, as you can see. It's very challenging exercises, but a lot of fun. So the assessment reporting, NNL and AWE both have reporting officer. This makes the job somewhat challenging because ideally we would like one joint report and assessment being passed to the police. But just like with a jury being led by a foreman, sometimes that foreman can't get full buy-in from everybody, and you may have to provide an assessment that says, well, we're pretty sure about this, but we're not so sure about this. And we have to make that clear in our assessment, and we tell the police very clearly what we are confident about and what we're less confident about. And that's important as that information gets fed up through the senior investigating officer, and potentially, if it's a serious event, could be fed to government's COBRA committee and certainly on into government. So we have to be very clear about what we're saying and what we're confident about. So my statisticians perform a really important role because they help us define the language for communicating uncertainty and confidence in our assessments. And we've been working with the International Technical Working Group for Nuclear Forensics, ITWIG, that Mansi had alluded to. We are working with them to help promote that kind of language and how you actually communicate uncertainty in clear terms. And again, that is our team working, having a brief from one of our reporting officers from a couple of years ago. So we exercise. I won't labour this slide, but one of the things to say is we have annual exercises, and I alphabetize them and brand them. You tend to get better buy-in if you brand the exercises. People feel like they're part of something bigger, and each exercise has got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I have to say, the teams, it's not me, I just run the program for this. The teams are fantastic, and they have just delivered better every single year. But we are always looking for new subject matter experts, new specialists, and always looking for that next breed of people coming through. So if you're an A-level student or an undergraduate and you're wondering where your science might take you, nuclear forensics is an exciting place to be taken. It really is. And on that note, I'm going to do a shameless plug for next year's NuFor. Coronavirus may well still be with us next year, but I have been talking with the Institute of Physics to our good friend Claire Garland, who's helped put this together. And we've got a date for next year. And if all goes well, if we can't meet in person completely in London, then we may be able to do some kind of hybrid event where some people can meet and the rest of the conference will be done as a virtual event like this. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and see if I can navigate this now. And see if I can pick up the questions. So do I need to click on that? So Joel Smith, thank you. The difference between the library and the archive for the UK programme. So first of all, we are, sorry, look at the right camera. We are currently, as far as AWE is concerned, in defence materials, we are not building a physical archive of nuclear materials. We've explored it and decided that's not for us. We have enough data and information to fall back on that we don't need to do that. There is a initiative at the moment through the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority to look at a national nuclear archive in terms of reactor materials. That's still in the feasibility stage, as I understand, and that potentially would provide some interesting information to the National Nuclear Forensics Library construct, but would mostly lie within the preserve of National Nuclear Laboratory rather than AWE. But AWE and NNL both have a seat at the table, as it were, with the development of that study. So they're significantly different. The library, the National Nuclear Forensics Library, is, as I said, that process by which we produce assessments to the police and government, whereas the archive that's being discussed at the moment is about having a resource that primarily, as I understand it, academia can access to do interesting work on and understand materials better. I hope that answers your question. And whoops. Olivia, does AWE do R&D into detection forensic technology, or do you use existing technologies for lab analysis? Okay. So we do R&D into detection science. It's not my area, and it's outside of the scope for this conference. If you want to drop me a line, I can put you in touch with somebody who may be able to speak to you, depending on where your line of inquiry is going. So I won't get into that here. Do we use existing technologies for lab analysis? AWE and NNL have a very large array of analytical capability. I won't go into that for the reasons I mentioned earlier about talking about specific capabilities. But if you're an analytical chemist and you were at AWE or NNL, you wouldn't be short of analytical techniques to throw at the problem. We have some of the most advanced kit on the planet. It really is quite impressive. Again, if you want to know more about the lab capabilities, I can put you in touch with the lead for that. They may be able to respond to you. Okay, Martin, what are these exercises exactly? Are these public events? No, they're not public at all. These exercises, I showed them to just illustrate how many exercises we get through. We exercise the capability as the capability grows, and it's constantly evolving. But no, they are not public events, and certainly wouldn't be intended to be, especially as we've mentioned and Nancy's mentioned as well. These are things that you don't necessarily need to share widely. You certainly don't want to share what your capability gaps are, if you've got any at all, that is. So, anonymous attendee, this is a very good question and is really close to my heart. Is nuclear forensics a male-dominated field? What would your recommendations be for a female looking to work in this field? My first recommendation would be to get involved, get into science or a related field. There really does need to be more females coming into science. I'm a chair of governors at a local school, and it's a big concern of mine. There just are not enough young women going into science, and certainly getting some of the big jobs in science as well. There's no bar to getting into it. It's male dominated just because, well, I can't give you a really good reason why. It just seems to be a natural thing that more men are coming through into STEM subjects, which is wrong in my view. It needs to be far more even. So one of my big recommendations is network. If you want to get involved in science generally, nuclear, moreover, and nuclear forensics specifically, you need to meet people, go to conferences, talk to people, go to seminars, come to things like this and engage, talk to people. If you get to know people, you get to find a way in, and then you can get into whatever field you want to be in. But you've really got to make links. That's the most important thing I think I can say. But yeah, we need more women in nuclear forensics generally. Mark Scott, since you're having to largely rely on part-time nuclear forensic subject matter experts, how confident are you that their work will hold up in a court of law, since they won't be very practiced in the process? That is a fantastic question, and is one that we are constantly looking at. So first off, we try to avoid using, and I know I've done it repeatedly in my brief, we try to avoid using the term subject matter expert, particularly for members of the provenance assessment panel. You don't need to be an expert to support the panel. You do need to be a specialist. You need to have specialist knowledge. That could be analytical knowledge, it could be knowledge of the nuclear fuel cycle. But you don't need to be an expert. And the reason I mentioned the jury and the jury foreman analogy is I've been that foreman. And it was interesting to see how you didn't need to have any one person in that jury to be an expert. They just needed to be guided carefully, given all the information and facts, and then made to work with it. And I found this fascinating. So it's the model that we've adopted. I'm not saying it's the best model. I'm not saying everybody should do it, but it appears to work for us at the moment. But I would not call anyone a subject matter expert, because any one of them could, and I'm reminded of this constantly by our police leads, any one of them could potentially be called up to give evidence in a court. If you call them an expert at the start, you are really setting yourself up for a fail potentially, especially up against a good barrister. In terms of them being part-time, yes, I have no staff that work on nuclear forensics, bar one, full-time. Now, that isn't a problem. I'm making use of their day job. I'm making use of their specialism. I've got people that are doing modeling on nuclear reactors. I've got people that are doing statistics. So they're doing their day job all the time. So I don't really have a problem with them being part-time for nuclear forensics and for the province assessment panel, because they're still doing their job. How confident am I that it would hold up in court? That remains to be seen. We've not tested this in quite the way that we would potentially like to see how it would stand up. But we do work closely with the police to see if they're happy and think that we're in a good place. And we seem to be doing the right things at the moment, but there's more work to be done. So it's a great question. And okay. Okay, Amir, is there a source or person whom someone with particle, nuclear and radiation physics experience contacts regarding relevant vacancies? For both AWE and NNL, I'd recommend you visit our respective websites. All of our vacancies are posted regularly on there, and that would be your best approach. In fact, for any of the nuclear enterprise in the UK. Enrique, I'm interested to know more about lab capabilities, not for the individual techniques, but for the potential of hyphenation and combined with AI and other. Are there projects in that area? We do use a lot of hyphenated techniques. Again, if you drop me a line, I'll be happy to put you in touch with the analytical lead, and he may be able to help you. Another anonymous attendee, I have a forensics degree and I've worked in health physics. Is there anything else I could be doing to have a career in nuclear forensics? It goes back to what I said earlier. Network, get out and meet people, find people in nuclear forensics, and ask questions, build relationships, and eventually you may well find your way in. Frustratingly, there is no, as far as I know, in the UK at least, there is no job that has the title nuclear forensics in it. Even my job title doesn't really have nuclear forensics in it. So to say you're a nuclear forensics practitioner is a little bit thin, shall we say, but there are opportunities that support nuclear forensics in the round. Mark Scott, excellent reply. Yes, as well as the networking opportunities, of course, attend ASADA, the INNM conferences. The IAEA often run conferences that are of relevance as well. A quick Google search will find many of them. And of course, when we can meet in person, come back to NuFor. And possibly finally then, how do nuclear forensics processes vary in neighbouring states? How closely do we work with other countries? So that's a difficult one to answer. You can probably imagine that we work quite closely with the US. I'm not going to go into that because this isn't the forum for that. but it's really down to individual states and the relationships they have with their neighbouring states as to whether those processes vary. There is some information sharing that's done through the International Technical Working Group for Nuclear Forensics, and best practice is actually shared at that forum. It's not an open conference as such. You need to be invited to come along, but I think I forget the numbers now, but there's well over 100 states that participate on a regular basis. So we do compare to a large extent how we approach nuclear forensics libraries, for instance, in the classical sense of library, and also how we do the processes. And as I said, we also share how we worry about communicating uncertainty and confidence levels and so on. But yes, it's a slightly tricky one to answer easily. Okay, so with that, sorry, you have to bear with me because I've lost my screen. So I'm going to suggest that we're not going to go anywhere, but we will take a short 2 or 3 minute break to allow people to have a natural break. And when we come back, Paul Thompson from AWE is going to tell you a bit more about what nuclear forensics is and why you should be specifically interested. It's a really good talk. And then later on, we've got Zolt Varga giving us a case study on an investigation into uranium materials. And then to finish the day, we're going to have Dave Meyer from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory talking about Hanford's legacy, the US technical history of plutonium production for the Manhattan Project, which was, of course, the project to build the first atomic bomb. So I think we're going to keep this open, but we'll start again in about 3 minutes' time. Thank you all. Okay, so let's see how many people have returned. Okay, Karen, I think we are back to the numbers we were at. So I'll hand over to you to chair the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roy. So good afternoon and welcome to this second session of NuFor on nuclear forensics in action. So I'm Karen Kennedy and I work on the nuclear forensics programme with Dr. Roy Aubrey. And so far we've had some great talks from Roy and from Mansi about what nuclear forensics is and how it works. So then this afternoon we have 3 more talks which are on putting this theory into practice and how this happens. So in this final session, we've got 3 speakers. First up, we've got Paul Thompson, who works at AWE. He's a distinguished scientist, and he's going to be talking today about the technical aspects of nuclear forensics and how you can become involved. Paul will be followed by Zolt Varda from JRC Karlsruhe, and he's got an example of a real nuclear forensics investigation that they undertook in Germany and how that went. And then finally, we have Dave Meyer from PNNL in the US, and he's going to be presenting on the history of plutonium production for the Manhattan Project. So 3 very different talks to look forward to, and I'm sure we'll find them all really fascinating. So as before, if you've got any questions for any of the presenters, please put them in the Q&A box down the bottom, and we'll address them at the end of each of the talks. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker to this session, Paul Thompson from AWE. So Paul has been working in the field of radiochemistry for over 40 years, progressing from initial laboratory analysis to be the distinguished scientist that he is today. He specializes in environmental chemistry and national nuclear security. Paul has regularly represented AWE at national security meetings and events, and has been a member of internal UK committees on environmental radiochemistry. He's a chartered member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, and for 2 years, the maximum that was allowed, was the chair of the radiochemistry methods group of the Society. Paul has represented both AWE and the UK at the Nuclear Forensics International Working Group, ITWIG, since its inception, and has participated in co-authoring IAEA documents on the subject. He is one of the lecturers on the Nuclear Forensics Methodologies course run by the NNSA, the IAEA and ITU. So as you can see, Paul has a wealth of experience and knowledge in this field, and we look forward to hearing his views. So over to you, Paul.
Okay, so hopefully the world can hear me. So Claire, if we can move on to the first slide. So yeah, unlike the rest of them, we're going straight onto the slides. You don't get to see me, or maybe we will at the question time at the end. So you can't see the fact I haven't actually had my hair cut since we started COVID. So yeah, the title of my talk, what is nuclear forensics? Why should I be interested? It's going to sound a little bit like some of what we've already heard. So you could look on it as a test of what you've already heard. So yeah, let's get on to the first slide. So the idea is to this talk was to follow on a little bit from Roy said, to get a wide audience and persuade them that they really wish to become a dedicated nuclear forensics contributor, and that they can, that their skills are actually suitable. I don't know how many of you actually knew anything about nuclear forensics. I presume you did, or you wouldn't have signed up for the course. But as Roy said, you must be glancing at my notes. If you got a degree in astrophysics, yeah, you're more than welcome. We can find a place for you in the nuclear forensics program, regardless of whether at the moment you've got no interest, little interest, passing interest, or just had nothing better to do to sign up for this because you're so bored of sitting at home looking out the window these days. Okay, next slide, please. So some loose definitions of nuclear forensics. Roy went a little bit into what is actually done for it. But one of the problems with nuclear forensics, I find, is there is no definition. It depends very much who you talk to or what institution they worked for as to how they've worded their definition of nuclear forensics to suit whoever's doing the funding for them. Or also in the case of some academics, how desperate they are to get someone to fund their project and get it classed as being something to do with nuclear forensics. But the prime definition is, and always has been as far as I'm concerned, is to insist law enforcement, in other words, the police, in the event of a crime scene being found that is contaminated with radioactive material. And the reason you need a nuclear forensics lab is because all the traditional forensics labs, certainly in the UK, are not, that normally do fingerprints, DNA, and all the things that you normally see, are not able to handle large amounts of radioactivity. So you need somewhere to actually do that work that is licensed to handle those large amounts of activity. Next slide, please. And then, of course, ultimately, the radioactive material itself may be the main evidence for the case. It mightn't be the fact that you have got a scene that has got contamination from radioactivity, but that some radioactive material has been intercepted, come across, found, discovered, however you wish to phrase it, and you wish to know what it is, where it came from, and in fact, how to what to prosecute the people with. It's an interesting fact that until about 15 years ago, it wasn't actually a criminal offence to possess a nuclear weapon in the UK. It just never occurred to anyone that such a thing could happen, but it is now actually illegal to have a nuclear weapon, so don't go out making one, because you will actually now be committing an offence. The other thing that can be looked at, of course, is not only the radioactive material, but the properties of its packaging, and a sort of twist from the original idea of supporting the police in somewhere that's contaminated with radioactivity. It may even be that the radioactive material is contaminated with traditional forensics evidence. Therefore, you need a lab that is able to handle the radioactive material and take the traditional forensics of it if someone has left a fingerprint on a package that's contained the radioactivity or whatever. The police will always play safe, and they will send it to a lab that is licensed for the radioactive material, and then hopefully either do the traditional forensics there, or if we're really lucky, we can clean up the traditional forensics evidence and send it to one of the traditional labs and let them do their proper job. Sometimes you'll hear the material referred to as material out of regulatory control. That tends to be when the material that has been intercepted or found is in the gram or more kilogram quantities of material. Once you've got more than about 100 grams of most radioactive materials, especially types of uranium and plutonium, they are supposed to be registered and kept behind lock and key. And the IAEA spend their lifetime with inspectors going around looking to make sure people haven't lost any and it is all properly where it's supposed to be. That is what's then known as material that's definitely in its regulatory control as it's supposed to be. Next slide, please. So why should you be interested? This is where it would be the fun interactive bit if we were actually sitting in a conference room. In that, how many of you wouldn't really love to star in one of the TV shows like CSI or whatever? So if you all raise your hands if you think you'd like to do that, it doesn't really matter because no one can see you. But it's always is a good selling thing for us that there are an awful lot of programs like CSI and such like on the TV, and lots of people show an interest in it. And that is the reason. The only thing I can guarantee is that unlike an episode of CSI, a case for nuclear forensics will not conveniently be finished in an hour so you can go off to watch the next adverts or change channels. A nuclear forensics case could well go on for weeks or months. But having said it could go on for weeks or months, you will actually find that the police or whoever else has given you the sample will probably want the results from you, maybe even before you've actually got the sample in your lab. It is that important. So all we've got to do now is to find a use for all of you to all become potential nuclear forensics people. And notice I say your speciality. I don't say science. It's not just sciences that are required. Yeah. Good. So, anything you can do, there's a role for you. Roy went through some of these: chemistry, physics, engineering, maths. You can put all sorts of words in front of them: geochemists, geophysics, brands of mathematicians, statisticians we're very keen on, geologists. Zoology, you might think that's a strange one, but if you find a little bit of pollen, well, that probably goes to botany, goes with the botany. A bit of pollen, that might help you with explaining the route that the material's gone through. Historians, so if you've got a degree in history and are just looking through record books, that could be a very useful skill. If you've got a degree in economics and are used to how various firms trade between each other and working out all these things, all those things can go there. The only reason the list is that long is because if I make more in the list, the letters get far too small and you can't read them. So the list is by no means inclusive. We are finding that you can find uses for every skill in existence, I think, to do nuclear forensics. So next slide. So how might a history person be asked? So once you've got hold of the material and you've got some numbers about it and you trace it back to where you think it could have been made due to the science of it, you then want someone who's expert at looking through records to search through them to see if he can find details that such material, or she could find details of such material having been that place. And the questions you may ask of a historian was it made there, or was something similar to this made here? Could it have come from here? Where did it, if it was made there as a batch of material, where did they send it to? And if they also, with that batch of material, did they lose any of it? Did it all end up where it was supposed to be in doing that? And the historian can set out quite a spider's web as he follows all the different bits and pieces as they left the place where it was made. And each of the answers to those questions above will be part of the jigsaw, and all of it, when pieced together, help solve the crime and will lead to the arrest of the criminals who are involved in the event. Next slide, please. So an example of a nuclear analytical technique, as Roy said, there are lots of analytical techniques you could use. There are lots of signatures and bits of information you can get by using a particular technique on a sample, and that can give you clues as of the basic thing of what the material is, or it can even give you clues as to how it was made. Some things, because the state you find them in, you could work out what temperature they were heated up as, what precursors were made, where they were made from, and things like that. There are many labs in the world that are radiochemistry labs or materials measurement labs and such like. Exactly what they do depends on what their day job is. Unfortunately, as the answer to one of the questions was, there's no one lab really set up purely to do nuclear forensics. Fortunately, there is not the demand for that much nuclear forensics. The time to be worried would be if each country had to have such an institution, because that would mean there'd be a nuclear forensics case happening every day. So most of the labs have full-time jobs. In most cases, the jobs they do for their full-time jobs are not quite as exciting as a nuclear forensics job, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that is true of all labs. There are some labs, or some people will enjoy their current job so much they may even feel a bit non-amused at having to do a nuclear forensics investigation, in which case good luck to them. But yeah, certainly nuclear forensics is a very interesting and fulfilling job when you get to do it. Next slide, please. There are lots of different instruments. They can all do the analysis to a greater degree. Some of them can do it quicker than others, cheaper, more accurately, can do more properties, find out more things about the material. It has to be a joint analysis as to what analysis is done. The sample isn't just given to the scientist and said, go off and tell me as much of this as you can. The sample belongs to the police, and they have to authorize any analysis you do for it. And probably at the end of the day, they're going to have to pay for what you've done for them. So all they really want you to do is enough for them to do the prosecution that they require. And the other important thing is not to go off doing any fancy technique that is not validated, because at the end of the day, the results you give are going to have to stand up in a court of law, and some barrister will take great delight in tearing you apart. So as far as we're concerned as analytical radiochemists, the idea is to make sure all our records are perfect, all our analytical techniques are validated, and they can go and find someone else who's got a weak part of the case and pick on them and leave us in peace, because we'll have done our job perfectly and there will be nothing to find at fault with our little bit of the work. Next slide, please. So what are the requirements? Well, they're varied. Each nuclear forensics case has been very different. The requirements will depend on what radionuclides are present. It could just be a single thing like it's a cobalt-60 source, in which case it may just want the cobalt-60 identifying, or someone may have found a full kilogram of plutonium or uranium and wants to know exactly what it is, where it came from, and all that, because there are fairly serious implications for nuclear security if 2 grams of plutonium or highly enriched uranium are floating around in the world. That should not have happened, because that should be all safely behind fences. What's required after you've done the initial identification of the material will depend on what is required by the police and what information is held by the institution that's doing it. And again, I re-emphasize the fact that really you're doing it on behalf of the authorities. It is not a research project. You're not doing a second PhD on this sample that suddenly you've been given. And you've got to keep records in great detail, as has already been said, about what you did and how you communicated it to the relevant customer. And in fact, you should make sure it's the customer that does any talking to the outside world. It is not the analytical lab's job to do that. So next slide. Okay, this repeats a little bit of what I've already said. So yeah, I think we'll skip this one. Go on to the next one. So what nuclear forensics is not. Unfortunately, it is not a full-time career. There is no country that's got sufficient cases to justify a full-time job in it. The nearest you get to it being a full-time job is those in academia doing research on it. But if you're doing research on it, your research will tend to be for a project for 3 years or so, or will sponsor a PhD to do it for 3 years. There's no guarantee we'll put a PhD in that university again. And we have got, as Mansi said at the very beginning, there's a continual fight to find fund for projects and justify why we need that project doing, what it will give to the world and everything. So as I said, it's normally not a full-time career doing it. So normally the nuclear forensics is tagged on maybe as a room or two that is kept specially for nuclear forensics, kept nice and clean. No other samples go in it, so we can't get any cross-contamination. So it could end up at a nuclear safeguards lab, a nuclear security lab. Some countries, it's a part of the job of their nuclear regulator, or some places are nuclear research institutes like JRC, which Zolt, the next speakers from, or I guess AWE to some extent is a nuclear research institute, or there's quite a few other ones scattered around Europe as well that have got the nuclear forensics tagged onto them. Next slide. But what do you need if you want to join the program? Curiosity. If you're really curious about the nuclear fuel cycle, and as Roy said, you do some networking, you appear at meetings like this, have a look on our websites, find jobs to apply for. It might say nuclear forensics, but you may well find that you end up doing 5% of your time or so on a nuclear forensics project, or sometimes you might even spend a whole 6 months, depending what happens. So nuclear forensics is quite capable of accepting anyone, training them. I guess what I had really thought of is, yes, there's even a role for legal barristers and things in nuclear forensics, because one of the things we do need training on is how to behave in court and making sure we don't put our foot in that. And we do actually get trained in that. So we do know how to behave in court and how to address the judge and all those sorts of things. Whatever your skill set it is, it may be applicable to be used in a particular scenario. Don't expect to be involved in every scenario that's going. If it's a lump of plutonium and you're a uranium chemist, you might have to sit that one out. But hopefully one will come along which you can take part in. The only real proviso is if you actually want to be a person in the lab, you really do need to be trained in working in a lab, and especially be aware of the hazards of handling radioactive and nuclear material. That is definitely training that is given. We will not let anyone loose on that without having done quite a lot of training before they're allowed to touch anything. And if you are going to play with an instrument that is going to do measurements, you will have to be trained on that instrument, and you will have to be signed off as competent on that instrument. Otherwise, that would be a question that the defense barrister could use against us, as was this person actually trained to do that measurement on that equipment. Next slide, please. Good, that's as I thought. So, okay, that's the end of my talk. I don't know how we're going to do the questions on this bit. Is someone else going to do the questions, or am I going to?
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Paul. That was really interesting. So we have had one question come in for you.
Okay.
The average forensic scientist wouldn't place radiological or nuclear at the top of their list of anticipated risks. When is the nuclear forensics expert engaged?
Well, as Roy said, we don't really have nuclear forensics experts. What we have is we have people who are very skilled at certain areas of nuclear science. We would not be called in until the police had found a sample and decided it was radioactive or required us. And in the UK, once that had happened, that there are set channels for how AWE would be called in. And then a team of AWE experts would go out to assist the situation. And then it would be, choices would be made as to which people it was had the relevant knowledge to be involved with it. Decisions would be made as to whether or not the sample needed to come back to AWE to be analysed, whether it was all coming back, whether it needed to be subsampled or everything. So we would get involved somewhere in the discussion at the point of between it having been found to when it turned up at AWE.
Yeah.
But Roy apparently would also like to give an answer.
Did you want to say something, Roy?
Well, I don't need to add to what Paul said. I think he's answered it succinctly, to be honest. There is a question that's come up through email, though, and it's an interesting one. If you wanted to explore a career at AWE, and possibly NNL for that matter, what would
or any
be,
other country?
Indeed, but I've been asked whether it would be better to come in as a direct entrant into a specific post that's been advertised, or to come in on the graduate trainee scheme. Now, my personal view is the graduate trainee scheme at AWE is one of the best in the country. I would say that, of course, but it gives you a large breadth of knowledge across the business, which is valuable, particularly for people like me that are looking to get people involved in nuclear forensics and my fellow sponsors in the rest of nuclear forensics. But Paul, if you were pressed, what do you think is the best approach?
I would say it depends on where you are in your career. If you're coming straight from university, then come in on the graduate trainee system. If you're a PhD and you've been sponsored by us, we've probably already fingered you as a possibility to employ anyway. If you're a PhD that we haven't sponsored, then yes, you could apply for named vacancies on the website, or I believe you can still join the graduate trainee scheme, provided you haven't finished your PhD too long ago. If you've had 20 years experience in the nuclear industry and you've done some networking and such like and know someone at AWE, they may be able to steer you towards someone who wants you and may be aware of a job that is going to come up shortly before it actually gets on the website. So there's that. The other way that we recruit staff is we do take year in industry students. And a lot of the year in industry students, we treat it basically as a year's interview. They go back to their university to finish their secondment back at university, and then we'll bring them back to AWE because we know that they're truly suitable and sort of they've got a head start and ready to go. So yeah, it depends on you, your experience, your age, and exactly what you want to do, where you want to go.
Okay. So I had another question for you, Paul. You mentioned the police quite a lot, and we do have John Sim from the UK Police, who's going to be taking part in the discussions tomorrow. So do you feel that they actually understand the timescales that would be involved in doing an analysis and all the work that would need to go into it?
I have a feeling the police will slightly underestimate it, because it's not quite as quick as traditional forensics for the full details. However, if you just want to know what the nuclide is, we can probably tell you that within an hour or so. I think the bigger problem is going to be the ones, if it's a full-blown event and Sage has been called and the Prime Minister's gone into Cobra, we will have problems where they'll be wanting the results before we've even got the samples. And I think it's the ones that the police report to, if it is treated as a national problem, who will be the ones who won't understand how long it takes. And that there is an awful lot of difference between an initial result where you can tell them, yes, it's radioactive, no, he should, and yes, he certainly shouldn't have it, you can charge him, and how long it will take us to have all the evidence prepared for it to go to court. But a full court case, if it was coming, probably would take several months. So we would definitely have all the evidence ready by then. Enough evidence to charge them and keep them in custody, we would definitely be able to do within the time the police would want.
Great, thank you. And one last very quick question. If a radiological nuclear material is recovered, who takes ownership of the material in the UK?
We would see it as the police, provided it was one involved with a criminal case. If it was one that was found by a different route, it may well be the Environment Agency would take charge of it in the UK, or it could be the official nuclear regulator would take charge of it. There are a set of plans in the UK that state if there is a nuclear incident or radioactive material is found, the nearest nuclear establishment will be the first to respond to it and help with it. That's not actually taking ownership of it, but it would be sort of standing guard over it, saying it's RA. They would have health physics experts who would say, yes, you need to keep this distance away from it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And somebody called Roy Aubrey would also like to make a comment on that question.
No, he wouldn't. I don't know where that came from.
You're allowed to get away with answering a question without needing corrected.
No, Paul answered that completely right, as I understand it. So I don't think there's any more to add to that. So thank you.
Can we just open the screen up so I can wave goodbye to everyone? Claire, is it possible to drop the slide and actually show the picture of me? I was just thinking if anyone ever saw me again, then they'd know who they were looking for to do any networking or whatever. Well, I can't see me on my screen, so okay, maybe we'll have to wait. That's the reason for coming next year.
We could see you, Paul. It's fine. You are recognizable.
Yeah. So this is what you look like after having spent a year in your working office without having your hair cut. So thank you all for listening and the questions, and hopefully, yes, we can meet in person next year. But as Roy said, if you want to contact any of us, email addresses, there was the one at the beginning of my talk. We'll try and help point you in the right direction. If you're not from the UK, we've done enough networking, we can point you in the direction of experts in most countries, because we have done an awful lot of networking and talked to a lot of experts from a lot of different countries.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, bye.
Bye.
So next up, we have Dr. Zolt Varga. So he's going to be actually talking about a real live forensic investigation after we've heard all the background to it all that actually took place in Germany on uranium from a German nuclear power project in the 1940s. So Dr. Varga obtained his PhD in analytical chemistry in Budapest, Hungary. In 2008, he joined the Nuclear Safeguards and Forensics Unit of the Joint Research Centre, JRC, in Karlsruhe, at the time the Institute of Transuranium Elements. He works with various mass spectrometers, single and multiple collector instruments, alpha spectrometry, and laser ablation. His research focuses on the identification and evaluation of sample characteristics for nuclear forensics, isotope measurements, and age dating examinations. So, are you here, Zolt?
Yes,
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, good morning.
So,
As Roy mentioned, I would like to give you a case study. So on the uranium project, which was in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s.
good. Did you have a set of slides?
Yes. I see.
Not sure. Do we have a set of slides for? Oh, here we go.
Clocks?
Excellent. Right, over to you, Zolt.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank all the organizers for the conference. I think organizing an online conference can be much more difficult than the face-to-face conference. In the talk, I would like to, now it doesn't work. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's right. So in the talk, I would like to speak about the aim of the study, how we got into the business, and I would like to give you some historical background of the project in Germany in the 1930s, 1940s. And afterwards, I would like to speak about the analysis that we take, the visual inspection of the material, uranium isotopic composition measurement, age dating or the production date measurement, the rarest pattern and the short-term isotope measurement for the origin assessment of the material. And I would like to speak about the low-level activation measurement of the 2C6, 2C9 plutonium measurement. And after all, I would like to conclude and give you some conclusion on the material. So the war story started when a group of boys found a cube in Liverloisach. Liverloisach in South Germany, close to the Alps. And they found the cube and they were fascinated that even though it's black, when they tossed on the pavement, it caused heavy sparks. So you know that the uranium metal is hydrophobic, and the boys were fascinated by that. And the volume was very small, quite small, but it was very heavy in the cube itself. And and the first suspicion was that it can be gold because it can be quite dense, but it was black, and so it doesn't match with that. One of the suspicious parents gave it to the local hospital to Garmisch-Partenkirchen to analysis, and it turned out that the cube itself is not gold, but it's radioactive. And a few years later, in the 90s, the cube was given to the German Federal Office for Radiation Protection, BFS, and the BFS some years later gave us a sample, the cube, for detailed measurement. And it turned out that it can be an original uranium sample from the German nuclear program. This was the finding. So the finding itself was quite precise cubical form with the sides of 5 by 5 by 5 centimeter, and the volume was very small, so 125 cubic centimeter, but it weighed about 2.54 kilogram. Uh, and the look itself was very suspicious, and also the radioactivity was very annoying somehow. And the question that we were posed by the German Radiation Protection Office are what are the macroscopic parameters and elemental composition of the material? Was this material? Was it aged, or in other words, was there any chemical, was lost chemical separation of the uranium? Is it possible that the cube is authentic? Is the uranium natural or enriched in 2C5? Was the uranium exposed to major neutron flux? So it means that the reactor itself, was it critical or not? How far did the German got, get in the nuclear program? And finally, what was the origin of the uranium ore used for the production? Going back the time, in those days, in the 1930s and 1940s, nuclear program in Germany usually was led by two groups. One of the groups was led by Werner Heisenberg himself. He was professor in Leipzig and Berlin. And when the bombing were more intense and the Allied approached, then the war experiments and war research focused in Haigerloch. That's in southwest of Germany, close to the Black Forest. And he performed L1, L4, and the B1, B8 experiments. The other group was led by Kurt Diebner. It belonged completely to the military, and they made the measurement in Kotov, so south of Berlin, and they start there, so in the middle of Thüringen in middle Germany. And they performed the G1, G3 experiments. How the uranium machines, how the reactor looked like. Initially, the structure of the uranium were in plates, so in the B1, B7 experiments. And later, they found out that the cubes, they have a better neutron economy, and they used uranium oxide, uranium metal, or uranium powder form. And for the moderator, they use ioparaffin for the plate experiments or heavy water for the cube experiments. This is how it looked like. So how the reactor looked like. They had different cubes, several hundreds of cubes, stringed together with wires, and the whole thing was dipped into the heavy water reactor. After the war, uh, the Allied forces investigated experiments and confiscated and recovered most of the nuclear materials. However, some cubes disappeared. Either they had a lock when they removed and they intercepted the material, and some cubes were also stolen in Garmisch-Partenkirchen from the German military track when they retreated from the Allied forces. So it's not impossible that we actually found a real specimen from the nuclear program. The visual inspection that we performed on the material, it was very cubic with mass sizes of approximately 5 centimeter each, and it was very heavy. The density corresponds more or less to the uranium metal density. So it's 19.1 gram per cubic centimeter. And the cube itself had two notches on the opposite side. This was used to fix the wires. And it corresponds to the description of the uranium metals which were produced by Degussa in 93, 94. And it was the same cube which was used in the G1 and B8 experiments. G means the cutoff, B Berlin. That also narrows down the possibilities that we have, which kind of material we have. When we analyze the sample, we analyze the original material that we found, that we got, but we also took some samples, some comparison samples from Hagerlock, some real cubes which were confiscated during after the World War II. We also measured some plates, some so-called beer plates from Heidelberg, which were used for other experiments, but it was from the same time and same era. And we also analyzed different yellow cakes and uranium ores to make sure that the analysis and the authentication is correct. We also analyzed yellow cakes from the Hannes Strassmann laboratory from Berlin. By the way, this is a lab which invented the fission, nuclear fission of the uranium. And for the original assessment, we also analyzed Einstein-Yahimo ores, uranium ores, and Stinkolobbe mines from the Belgian Congo. And these two places were the possibilities where the German got these uranium ores for the uranium metal production. We measured the uranium isotopic ratios with TIMS. It turned out that all the samples have a natural uranium composition, both for the uranium-235 and also for the uranium-234. It turned out that also the uranium-236 level was very low in the material. It was of course an indication that the sample, the reactor, was not exposed to major nuclear fluence, so it wasn't critical. We also measured the age or production date of the materials. The technique based on the 234 thorium uranium 234 chronometer. During the production, the uranium is also separated from the impurities. All the impurities are purified to make uranium metal. So all the impurities, including the daughters, are removed. So at the time of the separation, when the cube is prepared, that the thorium-230 is 0 at the time. And after that, thorium-230 as the daughter product of uranium-234 starts to grow in the material according to the decay laws. It turned out that all the samples were prepared in the 140s, and all the samples are authentic materials. The Heisenberg cube and the comparison sample were prepared a bit later, so in 1943. The Weir's plate was prepared a bit earlier, but all the samples were authentic and were prepared in the 1940s. There was a question of where the uranium ore comes from. In those days, for the German, there were two options to get the uranium ore. Either the Belgian Congo in Stinkolobbe mine or the Yahimo in Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia in those days. Luckily, the two ore bodies are quite different. And if you measure the radius pattern in the samples of the ores, which is a very good indicator of the origin, they have a very, very different pattern in that. The radius of the lanthanides, they are quite similar chemically. So that pattern, the overall pattern is somehow indicative of the ore that you use, that you mine, mill the material from. The Steenkohle ore was a so-called bell-shaped pattern with a maximum of dysprosium and terbium, while the ore from Joachimsthal was a declining pattern with a significant europium anomalies in that. We also measured the unknown samples, the Heisenberg cube and the weird plate and the yellow cake from the Hanley. And it turned out that all the samples have the same pattern as the Joachimsthal-Yahimov ore. So all the uranium was prepared from that. This was also supported by the strontium isotope ratio afterwards. We did a low-level 2C6 measurement by the so-called accelerated mass spectrometry, the AMS technique. AMS is very reliably can be used very reliably for the measurement of 2C6 uranium when the 2C8 uranium is present. All the samples have very low uranium 2C6 content. The reason for that is that you have uranium 2C6 in natural uranium is the so-called alpha end reaction. When you have a alpha decaying nuclide like uranium, then the alpha particle which is produced by the decay can produce a neutron flux. When the alpha particle hits a light element, then it causes an alpha end reaction. So in the ore body, you have a very small but significant neutron flux. And this can cause an activation and formation of uranium-266 in the sample. In all the investigated material, the uranium-266 was very low and very close to the natural one that we analyzed also in the arrow cakes. That was also an indication, but it's a very solid indication that the reactor was not critical. This was also verified by the plutonium-239 activation product. Plutonium-239 is also an activation product like the uranium-236. It can be used for the measurement of the criticality and neutron flux in the sample. It turned out that all the samples, the Heisenberg cube, the Beers plate, and the Yahimov ore had very low plutonium-239. So there was no sign of significant neutron fluence in the sample. You can wonder why the Joachimsthal-Yahimov ore can have a higher plutonium-239 amount. The reason for that if you have alpha end reactions, you have plutonium, very small amount of plutonium in the ore body. But during the preparation of the uranium cube or the uranium metal, then all the impurities, including the plutonium, are diminished. So the plutonium in the final product will be much less than in the initial starting material. At the end, I would like to give a short summary on the Heisenberg cube. We measured multiple signatures. It can also increase the confidentiality with the measurement. So we can more rely on the results what we get afterwards. All the samples that we faced are authentic pieces from the German nuclear program. The material was produced in the 40s. Weir's plate dates back to 1940. Heisenberg cubes were prepared in 43, 44. And the ore for the production of the uranium was not from Azerbaijan, Congo, but from Joachimsthal-Yahimov. And the low neutron exposure or low neutron fluence indicated that the reactor was not critical. No, and possibly they couldn't prepare 239 plutonium with this uranium machine. If you are interested in, there are some more details and more results in the paper. And with this one, I would like to thank for your kind attention.
Thank you, Zolt. That was really interesting. So we unfortunately we're pushing for time here, so I've only got time for one question. So we had a comment from Marta Bavio, who said this is a really exciting case. Could you have performed the radiochronometry by TIMS instead?
Yes, if you have enough material, yes, you can. It depends how much material you have, and theoretically, yes, you can. We also made a kind of interlaboratory comparison, which kind of technique can be used, TIMS, ICP, multi-collector ICP, and it turned out that the best is ICP and not TIMS. But theoretically, you can perform the measurement.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Apologies we haven't got time for the other questions today.
You're welcome.
But you should be able to see them. So after Zolt, our final speaker today is Dr. Dave Meyer from PNNL in the US. I guess, good morning, Dave. I assume, is it morning where you are?
Yeah, it's good morning. So I want to say hello and how are you all today? Let me see if I can work to share my screen.
Have they not got your presentation? Oh, okay.
Well, I was kind of a late adder, so I have done everything I can to be able to present this morning. Can you see my screen?
I can personally, yes.
All right. I saw some chatter in the chat that some of the presentations aren't showing up. Is there anyone that isn't seeing it, or are we good to go? Or
well, I was going to read out your nice bio all about all the great national, international work that you're doing, but because we are running quite a bit behind, are you happy to just go?
You know, I am, and I thank you. You know, that's an absolute perfect introduction, Karen, and I thank you for that. So we're good. So a lot of people on this call don't know, but I had the absolute wonderful privilege of having a 6-week secondment in the United Kingdom earlier this year, right before COVID hit. And I had the privilege of being able to be with Roy and Karen and his team and their team for 6 weeks. And it was an amazing experience. And I'm really glad to have had that. You know, I will do my best to tell you what I can about this in this brief window of time. But what I really need you to understand is, and it really kind of goes back to the beginning of this talk, was, you know, Roy wanted, what he really wanted to talk about was how nuclear forensics is all about being prepared. And so, you know, how do you do that in today's environment? You know, how do you do that when you're dealing with, in the perspective of the United States, when we have not had an active plutonium processing capability from a reactor base since the 1990s? You know, how prepared are we to understand the nuclear forensic signatures of materials that processed or gathered by our adversaries? And so when I was thinking about today's talk, you know, one of the things that I really am interested in is a technical history of the Hanford site, where plutonium was processed for World War II and then for the Cold War beyond. I call this talk Hanford's legacy, and so I'll give you a preamble, because at the end of the day, there are people in this talk, in this audience today, that is going to be a legacy of our efforts, and it's the young people. It's people early on in their careers where they're starting to ask the questions of how can I contribute? And to be honest with you, it's the fact you're asking the question that energizes us. So without any further ado, I'll get through this as quickly as I can. But what we're looking at is when you think of the Hanford site, it is a very large site, all right, and roughly in scale to the city of London. But if you notice the picture in the upper left-hand corner, looks absolutely nothing like the city of London. It is in a mountainous and rugged terrain. It is bounded in nearly 3 of its sides by the Columbia River in the south central area of the state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest. It all the reason why Hanford even came into existence is because of efforts going on in Europe during World War II, when Szilard and Einstein understood that fission could be a problem. And so I know it comes across as a joke, right? An Englishman, a Belgian, and an American meet in an African mine. But if it wasn't for a chance encounter of an Englishman talking to a Belgian guy who happened to own a mine in Africa, the United States may not have had the uranium inventories required to achieve the missions that they achieved and achieve the goals they achieved during the Manhattan projects. And the one thing you got to keep in mind is, as you can see, with the punch card and the slide rule, all this happened before computers. These happened before, happened before modern computers. It happened before cell phones. It happened before Netflix and the internet. All right. We really are talking about people who are absolute mental giants in their fields. So there really are 2 different pathways when you're talking about the Manhattan Project. You have uranium and plutonium. Now, uranium you can dig out of the ground. The problem with uranium is you have pesky isotopes, right? You have uranium-238, which is essentially what you're digging out of the ground, but it's just doesn't do the job as uranium-235 does. So in a sense, uranium becomes an engineering problem. How do you take very large, how do you take a really small weight difference and separate it out? And there were and there still are some very brilliant minds that take care of that. Now, plutonium is a much different beast. Now, it does require engineering because you need actually irradium in order to make plutonium. But at the end of the day, it becomes a chemistry problem. How do you separate something that is dissimilar from something else? And not only that, when you irradiate uranium, you're essentially, all you're really doing is you're making a plutonium contaminant at a very small level, part per million, hundreds of parts per thousands or something of that nature, or hundreds of parts per millions, tens of parts per millions. And then how do you separate that out? And how do you gather it? How do you get enough of it that you could do something with it on a physical scale? Plutonium, as I indicated, is made in the reactor. It's essentially, you radiate natural uranium. You're going to create a very short-lived daughter called uranium-239, which then actually beta decays into plutonium-239. Now, if it was just that easy, you'd leave uranium in a reactor and you'd let it irradiate for a long time. And the reality is, though, physics happens. And so while you're irradiating uranium-238, you're also irradiating plutonium-239. And so you're making heavier and heavier, and you're creating a different kind of isotopic spread of the material that is actually less ideal over time. And so not only did you have to do it, you had to figure out how long you can do it. And then again, they were learning the physics as they were going along. There wasn't a chart of the nuclides that was in depth that you can go and see, okay, the cross section of this nuclear reaction is so many barns. That did not exist at the time. Seaborg and company actually went out and made some of the groundworking physics that we rely on today. In addition to plutonium's new interesting plutonium or nuclear processing production, the chemistry is amazing. This is a very generalized kind of plutonium chemistry table in view. The only elements, according to this chart, and this chart is a little bit dated, the only elements that do not have known ice or chemical compounds are the ones in the dark blue on the chart of the nuclides in front of you. So take a moment to ponder that. This element that has just been created is extremely reactive with just about every other naturally formed material on the planet. You know, and we made this. that's the fun part to remember, right? We actually made this wanting it to do something else, but in a sense you open Pandora's box, because as any plutonium chemist today will tell you, plutonium chemistry is some of the most interesting and challenging plutonium chemistry that people deal with, and that has to do primarily with really complex chemistry. Not only can plutonium in an acid solution exist in 4 different oxidation states, but it can also, at various temperatures, can exist in 6 or 7 different phases, and have many different crystal structures. And not only that, if you heat plutonium, and this is what they were trying to do back in one of the national laboratories at the time, we couldn't do this today, but when you heat plutonium, you actually get a huge exothermic reaction. So these are quite challenging, and these were situations that nobody knew this at the time when they were making plutonium for the weapons program. So the Manhattan Project, you know, in the very beginning, there are only so many sites, and if you notice in the map, they're spread all over the United States, and they were not in densely located areas. Typically, they were remote, and essentially it all started in a University of California lab and University of Chicago lab. Because remember, at that time, there was no national laboratories. And so the Met lab was in Chicago, and there was a plan of a processing, there was like a chemical lab in California, and it quickly expanded from there. The idea was to have the X lab near Chicago, but they dismissed that and found a place in Tennessee, which ended up being Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And in likely, they focused on the uranium efforts there, and they were going to do plutonium as well, but they said, well, let's do it in the hills of Tennessee. But they thought, you know, not a good idea, so they found a place in the state of Washington. And so that was really the origins of the Hanford site. They wanted a place. They knew they were going to need reactors. They wanted a place that was close to a colder body of water, remote, where they wouldn't have to, where they could keep security down and take care of security, but additionally could also manage the population at the time. So if you kind of look at this list, this is just kind of where things walk through. I'm not going to walk through all this, but if we look at the highlights, sorry, I'm having some difficulty. In June of 1940, Glenn Seaborg expressed an interest in the chemical separation of new elements. Okay, less than 2 years later, they identified plutonium. Well, okay, in October, they identified plutonium because they identified Neptunium, or what they said was the daughter. They identified a new element. It ended up being Neptunium, but it was too short-lived. And so they knew the daughter of that element they were producing was long-lived or longer-lived. And by October of that year, they identified it as plutonium. And within 2 years later, they're isolating the first quantifiable mass of 2.8 micrograms. And approximately 2 years after that, they're creating a nuclear reactor to produce kilogram quantities of this material. So everything is on lightning speed right now. Everybody's trying to finish the war. There were huge pressures on all sides. But it's absolutely amazing when you think of the humble beginnings of here's an idea to less than 5 years later, we have a weapon of unimaginable power. The Hanford site itself is located, like I said, in south central Washington. It is bounded by the Columbia River. We ended up having 9 nuclear reactors along the river. They were called, 8 of the reactors are called once passed through nuclear reactors, where you actually took water in from the Columbia River, went into the nuclear reactor, and then through a basin, you kind of a retention pond, but you eventually went right back into the river. That design obviously was updated. I mean, they did what they had to do in World War II. The designs are updated over the years, but you know, you got to understand the time. It's really easy to be an armchair a Monday morning quarterback here and to say, well, they shouldn't have done that. Well, you know, consider the alternative. You know, Europe needed our help. We need a game changer. And plutonium and uranium ended up being that game changer. If you notice the Hanford site, it's pretty sparse. But there are a few areas I want to focus in on. The nuclear reactors are essentially on the northern part of the site. They are reactors or B, C. You have K east, K west. You had N reactor. You had a D reactor and a DR reactor. You had H and then F. There were also a couple of chemical processing areas called 200 East and 200 West. Over the course of Hanford, 3 different chemical processing efforts were actually focused on. You had, you started out with bismuth phosphate. It was kind of a holdover from the petroleum industry. They knew it'd work. It was messy. It was inefficient, but by God, it did the job. Over time, and through the Cold War, they optimized it and created 2 different efforts, one called Redox and the other called Purex. This is the B reactor. It is actually the first reactor that was fired up on site, and it was fired up September 1944. The picture you see here was actually a picture that I took, probably within the last 2 to 3 years, and here's an archival picture right here. So I actually was able to find nearly the same perspective as the original photographer in this instance. But inside the reactor, and if you ever have the privilege of coming to PNNL, you can actually get a tour of this reactor. It's now a heritage site, so it is now protected and will forever be protected. But if you go in, you still can see the front face of the reactor, and that's the picture in the upper left-hand corner of this. And so what they would do is they would take fuel and they would put it in the front face and it would drop out the back. And you're essentially seeing the front face of a very large cube. And they would control that reactor through moderating, through control rods and other moderators. This is one of my dear friends and colleagues, Ted Vinetz. He used to work on the Hanford site. He was talking to me on that day about the operations. This is a pictorial. The front face is actually the right-hand edge of the big black reactor graphite core picture near his elbow. Everything else behind it is extremely radioactive. And so and he was explaining to me how you go from the reactor down to the 200 areas in order to get the plutonium in a space for processing. This kind of gives you an idea of how the reactors kind of performed over time. And you're probably wondering, what does DR mean? DR was actually a replacement for the D reactor. One thing they noticed in the early parts of reacting is they noticed bowing of the control of the actual the rods, or where they put the fuel elements. And so there are graphite rods that were bowing. They figured out the problem and they were able to save the D reactor in addition to B and F, but they were halfway done with building DR, so they just kept it on and kept things operational. And it's kind of interesting to note that DR was newer than D. D actually operated for 3 years longer than DR. So this is just giving you a kind of a brief idea of how many, on the left-hand axis, it's how many metric tons of uranium that were processed over time, over the years on the Hanford site. And on the right hand is how many gallons of waste that was generated. So as you can tell, oh, no, I apologize. That is not gallons of waste. That is actually grams of plutonium. Yes, that's kilograms of plutonium that were processed. My apologies. The chemical and material processing. So like I said, they had many different kind of processing efforts. The one thing to note is, even though the bismuth phosphate was kind of inefficient and problematic, it did the job. But once Purex showed up in 1956, they realized there really is no longer a need for bismuth phosphate, and so that whole processing plant was shelved. There were 2 actual processing plants at that time, B plant and T plant, and both of them were shelved once Purex was online. This really is a slide of the ingenuity of the Allies as they were trying to solve this problem. If you look at the timeline, we were building buildings on Hanford while they were still developing chemistries. So they were still working at the gram quantities when we were building capability for kilogram quantities on the Hanford site. And the reason why that could even possibly have happened is the image you see on the right-hand side, and that's one of the cells that were made. every facility that was made so versatilely. You could put anything in these cells, whether you need to dissolve it or you need to heat it or you need to centrifuge it. And if you look at all the connections on all the insides of that cell, there was one ingenious design called the Hanford connector, which is kind of one of the edges you start to see on these sides. Without things like that, you would never have been able to remotely modify the system. And this is really one of the reasons why, one of the key reasons why these sites were so successful in getting the mission accomplished. They're so ingenious with what they had to try to accomplish at the time. This just kind of gives you a very brief chemical processing summary of the site. How many metric tons of uranium were processed? How many metric gallons of uranium of waste was actually generated? And if you really look closely at the bismuth phosphate, it is the red that kind of drops out near 1955. You really see why Purex. You really see why they shelved it. Purex really, the processing capability of Purex really kind of blew it away. In addition to the Manhattan Project, Hanford really kind of grew over the years. And so it used to be we would take plutonium and they'd make plutonium paste and ship it down to Lannel. And it was, and from there on, they took care of it. But over the years, Hanford kind of took care of their own. And one of it was the PFP, which is the plutonium finishing plant. And part of the PFP was plutonium reclamation facility. And so I have just a few moments, but I just kind of wanted to have you focus in this picture. This row, there's a row of glove boxes on the bottom right-hand side of the building. And in the following picture, you can still see, this is when they're trying to dismantle the picture. This was a couple of years ago, dismantle the facility. You can still see the outline of those same glove boxes. And from another view, you see the same glove boxes from the inside. In that facility was also a canyon. It kind of gives you a kind of a before and after picture. And then these were all kinds of pictures that really kind of help isolate, understand the time. And this is probably one of my most favorite photos because you can see this, you can see a radiological boundary between these two people. But if you also notice, the guy inside is actually smoking a cigarette. So times are the times, you know, I mean, I don't judge because, you know, these same guys that are smoking a cigarette inside these lines also helped develop a nuclear deterrence that has kept this world safe through today, which is part of the legacy that I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of the fact that I work in the United States at a DOE laboratory. I know we generated 67 metric tons or 60 million gallons of radioactive waste. I understand that, but they are safely safeguarded on these sites. And 2/3 of our plutonium produced was made at Hanford. But you know, since World War II, the major superpowers of this planet have not engaged directly. And that is a testament to the hard work that both of our countries, United States and United Kingdom, have really tried to accomplish throughout the years. And with, I did it quickly as I could. I will gladly entertain any questions if there are any. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dave. It was really interesting. You're always so enthusiastic when you talk about it. I came over there several years ago and was lucky enough to get a tour of the Hanford B reactor. And it really is so large inside. You can't sort of visualize how large it's going to be till you actually see it.
Yeah. No, it is. And it is a gem. I remember the time I went, I had the privilege of getting kind of a tour from that worked on site. And so not only did I get to see the reactor, but I also got to learn quite a bit about some of the histories that aren't always on the public tour. And it just got me hooked. And I have really spent the last 3 to 4 years of my life really trying to develop this kind of talk and these kind of a technical understanding. And one of my passions is, if you'll invite me next year, to start incorporating the AWE or not, the United Kingdom's role in this as well, because that was one thing that I was unable to develop into this talk. But a dear friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Matt Gilbert, did provide me with an excellent text that I really want to start leveraging to just tell the bigger story. So
I'm sure you'll be more than welcome to present at NuFor 2021. No problem.
I hope
So
so.
I have a question for you. So obviously it was all done in an amazing timescale because of the war years and the war effort. Do you think it would ever be possible to construct a whole site like that again in this day and age with health and safety requirements and IAEA requirements, that sort of thing?
I think Karen, what you just said is absolutely key. When you look at all the requirements that are set into place to build a site like this, it would be extremely challenging to put a site like this together, to put it in a cost-effective manner. But that's also at a very real level why we're having these talks today, because the people that really want to do this aren't following all the rules. And it really is the work of our two countries and others that develop these nuclear forensics techniques and portfolios and programs to help just kind of understand who's out there doing what they're not supposed to be doing. But yeah, you nailed it. It's expensive. It would be challenging. I won't say impossible, but it would be very challenging in today's environment.
Yeah. And obviously you had a vast amount of waste that was produced from all that. Is there any sort of timescales in which it can be disposed of, or is it just there forever?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. It's one of those things that I'm a father of 5 kids, and the best way I could say it is you never wake a sleeping baby. And when at the end of the day, it is in a safe configuration because it's managed by people that have been managing it for over 60 years, and they know what they're doing. And so, yes, I'm sure we could wrap it all up, put it somewhere else, and have it do its thing. But some of these waste configurations, in their current form, they need to sit for a very long time. Now, if we could get creative on how and push and research and how do you sequester some of the long-lived from short-lived, then we can start dealing with, and I know work is going on in that fashion, but a lot of still needs to happen. But the Hanford site is remote, and so it's in an excellent location to just kind of let things sit. And those people that they're keeping an eye on it every day of the week, 24/7, 365 days a year, and they have done for many, many, many decades.
I guess it presents challenges for future scientists to look at, as time goes on
Absolutely.
and techniques progress. So I'm
Absolutely.
sorry to wrap it up there, Dave, but we have gone on for 30 minutes longer than we had anticipated. So I'm sure people will be needing to get on and go and do all
No
the
problem.
things.
It was my honor. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in this forum, and I sincerely hope I get the opportunity again.
I'm sure you will.
Have a nice day.
Always great to hear you. Thank you. I see you're back, Roy. Did you want to?
I am. I shall just give some closing remarks. So thank you, Dave. That was a really fascinating presentation. Thank you, Zolt, as well. Equally fascinating presentation. I'd not heard that one before. And of course, to Paul Thompson for his ever effusive take on nuclear forensics, which I hope has, with all 3 of them, have garnered interest in getting involved with us. And of course, we all started off with Mansi Iyer really giving us the global perspective on all of this. I hope it's lived up to expectations. Tomorrow is going to be really quite exciting. It's the first time we will have put together a panel discussion, and it's quite a good panel in my view. We've got SO15, Counterterrorism Command, the FBI, National Nuclear Laboratory. Mansi is going to be back with us again, and someone who used to be at the International Atomic Energy Agency, David Smith, a very good friend of ours, and he was a keynote speaker last year at the NuFor conference. He will be on that panel tomorrow as well, and yeah, it's going to be an interesting day. And then we also have an interactive session from Frank Wong, which I've seen delivered at the International Technical Working Group for Nuclear Forensics. It's well worth seeing, so do please come back tomorrow. We might be better with our timings, but it's testimony to how engaging this has been. We've had lots of questions either directly to me through email or on the chat here. So yes, we will try to provide contact details for all of the speakers. We'll work with the Institute of Physics to see how we publish those. And some of the questions couldn't get answered because of time constraints today. We'll do our best to try and pick those up tomorrow, or at the very least get those questions to the presenters so that you can get those answered. We will try our best not to leave any questions unanswered or any leads not followed up. And just to pick up a couple of things in the chat, yes, Dave Meyer, very good friend of mine, he is coming back next year, without a doubt, one way or the other. Something I do want to just quickly pick up for those that are left. The collaboration that AWE and PNNL have, between myself and Dave and our teams, is one of the best collaborations that we've got within my programme. And we've actually gone further now and seconding our staff, and indeed have looked at seconding academics, our PhD students, for instance, for several months to PNNL, and we're going to try and reciprocate as well. So Dave, as he said, spent 6 weeks over at AWE. We were hoping this year to send somebody from AWE, but there are lots of opportunities, and this is the point I'm making. Get into nuclear forensics, get into science that's related to nuclear forensics. There are opportunities to travel, to work with some fine scientists around the world. There really are some boundless opportunities, especially when we're doing interesting and exciting work like this. So with that, I hope this has shown you how interesting and exciting nuclear forensics is. I find it incredible. Paul Thompson mentioned CSI and NCIS earlier. I think it's sexier than that, I've got to be honest. It's far, far better. So stick around, come back tomorrow and see how that goes. The panel discussion is going to be very exciting, I think. So with that, I'll let you all go off for your teas and breakfasts for those who are in the US. And I thank you all sincerely for your participation and your patience for our overrunning. It is the first time we've ever done it online, so forgive us. So thank you all very much and good night.
Thanks, Roy.